Before we get going with Dr. Gooding, I just have a few things to talk about. Here's the first. You have the option to change, turn on or turn off your captions. Take a look at your Zoom tools, and you should see the closed captioning button right there. Click on that, and you can change the settings to your preference. Let me talk about two things that are coming up here at the library. The first is on Tuesday, February 21st, as in tomorrow, 7 p.m. at our central library in the Rasmussen room on the second floor. We are welcoming back Ellie Carlson. She is going to come in and do a one-woman rendition of Phyllis Diller, talking about her life, doing some of her material. It will be a wonderful time. If you have not seen Ellie before, she is a hurricane of positive feelings and humor and just facts. She dives into everyone that she portrays and does an amazing job. That is a hybrid program. So if you decide that you want to stay home tomorrow, that's okay. Sign up on our website, schaumburglibrary.org. You'll have the chance to choose whether you want to be in person or virtual. When all of the in-person chairs are filled, we just have the virtual option available. Everybody is going to get a link to the video who signs up. So whether you decide to come in person or virtually, you'll be able to see the program. Again, that's tomorrow, 7 p.m. And then the second thing I kind of want to talk about is on Wednesday, March 1st. We are part of Illinois Libraries Presents, which is a virtual consortium of libraries, over 200 of us that are getting together, pooling our money, and trying to get some very big authors, celebrities, and other names. We have the writer Mary Roach. She is going to be talking with the science fiction and science writer Annalee Newitz. They're going to be talking about Mary and her prolific works. If you have not read a Mary Roach book, get one off your shelf as soon as you can. Her book Stiff, her book Packing for Mars, they're all deep dives into these scientific situations, the people, the problems, and she reports it all with a great sense of humor and an eye on results. So if you've never heard Mary speak or you would like to, again, that's Wednesday, March 1st, 7 to 8 p.m. You can sign up on our website, schaumburglibrary.org. That's where also you can find our other events and things that are going on. You can always call our info services desk. If you'd like to sign up for something, you can always talk to me, email me, call me, see me in person, flag me down. I'd love to hear from you. Okay, that's enough for me. I'm going to turn it over to our presenter tonight, Dr. Frederick Gooding.
All righty. Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome. It is a pleasure to be back in the space. And so let me see here, 1 second. Without any further ado, let's go ahead and get the party started. Again, good evening to everyone out there in Illinois land. I'm just very appreciative of everyone part of the Schaumburg Library staff, from Matthew to Diane, to everyone working behind the scenes to make spaces and places for us to talk about things that are important to us. So I'm very appreciative for that. And I'm quite user-friendly. And so, to the extent you have questions, feel free to ask them in the chat. After I put out a couple of thought concepts, we can also do some Q&A at the very end, and also provide my email address in case you wish to follow up afterwards, as this is a topic that deserves plenty of time and attention and conversation. So hopefully it's the beginning of a conversation here today and not the end of one, right? All righty. So the question is, how do we remember Black history? We, after all, are in Black History Month, February. It was started by, anyone know whose idea it was? A gentleman by the name of Dr. Carter G. Woodson, right? And what he really wanted to do was, recognize and give homage to two people who had birthdays in February, and that was Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass. So today, many school systems celebrated President's Day, but there was also this other individual, Frederick Douglass, that Carter G. Woodson wanted to recognize in terms of their roles that they played in abolition. And so from there, it was supposed to be Negro History Week, and it grew eventually to Black History Month. And at the time, it was novel, it was new, but now it's pretty common for many events or causes to have a week or a day or a month So if anything, if you celebrated, National Whale Month or something, in many ways, you have Black history to thank, in terms of helping to pioneer something that is part of America that we often take for granted. So speaking of thank yous, I wish to also just say thank you, sir, to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., one of the people that we're going to talk about today. I am in particular feel a special connection to Dr. King, seeing how we are both alumni of a proud tradition of schooling in Atlanta, Georgia. It's a school of 3,000 Black males. It is a historically Black college university named after white male general Edwin Morehouse. And so the name of the school is Morehouse College. He and I are both graduates of the same institution. So I feel a special connection to him in that respect. All righty. So our roadmap, quite simply, we're just going to do 3 case studies. I know we had advertised Dr. Martin Luther King and Harriet Tubman, but I thought I'd throw in a bonus 3rd case here. And I just want to give fair warning to everyone in advance that while we're not going to do anything that is controversial, I mean, all we're going to do is just talk about the truth. I would like to give fair warning in that some of you might have to go back to your high schools and demand refunds. Right? Okay. All right. So why don't we go ahead and just open things up? Now, anyone who has the ability to type in the chat, can someone give me an account as to what just happened, right? If you could just type what just occurred, what just happened, right? Feel free to use whatever language you want, but I'm just wondering whether I can get a couple of volunteers to type in what they just saw, what they just observed, what just happened, right? All right here. So, indeed, I showed you all a pen. And there's a reason for that. And I'm wondering whether we can at least get at least one other individual to give us an account as to what they saw, just in terms of just how would you describe it? How would you describe it? Right? Because the fact of the matter is that when we talk about memory versus history, we're talking about a topic that many of us take for granted. We go to the library and check out a history book and presume that everything that's in the history book is true and factual. That's the faith and belief. Otherwise, what utility is the book to us if it's not factual, if it's not accurate, right? But at the same time, one of the details that we often overlook or don't spend enough time discussing is just how exactly do we determine what is factually accurate when we tell a story, right? So when we talk about this idea of history versus memory, oftentimes what we're trying to do is figure out how to calibrate several memories at play before we can call it history, right? And so with the ink pen example, oftentimes when I do this, what happens is that you have numerous varying different accounts. No 2 answers are the same, right? And so even though many people share a very similar experience, right? Meaning that everyone's in the same Zoom chat room at the same time, watching, me hold up a pen and dropping it. Not everyone describes what they remember in the exact same manner, right? And so then we have a number of other questions to ask, such as, okay, well, if there's several of us in this space and we're sharing the space right now, how do we determine whose version is accurate or whose version is more accurate, right, than someone else's, right? At what point do you start the story? At what point do you end the story? How much detail is necessary in order to tell the story effectively, right? So these questions are quite profound. And we negotiate these questions oftentimes without even thinking about the true, layers involved. But I just wanted to start off by stating that history is not finite. History changes on a daily basis, because to the extent that we discover something today that we didn't know the day before, well, that's going to change our interpretation moving forward of how we view the past, right? So while so many people think that history is etched in stone and it is what it is and we can't change it, I would like to start off by disabusing that notion and reminding us that history is very much dynamic and is something that is accessible to each and every one of us, right? And so when we talk about the history of Black history, right, here are three names that are quite well known within Black history circles. The upper left-hand corner would be none other than Harriet Tubman. In the middle, you have Rosa Parks. And then at the lower right-hand corner, you have Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And so what we want to talk about are how they were regarded in the time period in which they lived versus how we remember them, right? So this idea of history versus memory, right? This tension that we wish to negotiate. So starting with Harriet Tubman first. The question is, why do we celebrate Harriet Tubman? What makes her so famous, right? Why is she so well known? Well, there's a number of reasons. For starters, she was absolutely badass. To have the amount of bravery and fortitude to make no less than 19 trips is hard enough, you think, to do it one time, but for her to do it multiple times and not on her own account, right? To do this for other people. And so what makes her such a fascinating, powerful story is the amount of altruism involved, right? For her to risk so much to save so many other people, right? And I think numbers range, in that roughly 300 number range as far as how many people that she eventually ushered to freedom, right, during the era of enslavement. And so it's a feel-good story. It is absolutely an awesome story because it talks about her heroism and her ingenuity and what she did to help people become free. But oftentimes when we talk about Harriet Tubman, though, as we see with continued consternation and debate and discussion, the question is, do we spend enough time talking about what she was attempting to free people from, right? And so in the state of Florida, you all may have heard the news where Governor DeSantis objected to portions of the advanced placement African American history course being taught, right? But Florida is not alone. Many schools in many parts of the country are having these debates as to, well, what part of the history do we tell and how do we tell it, right? Again, this tension between memory and history. So some people are arguing that woke culture is taking over and critical race theory is now in the classroom at the K through 12 level and it shouldn't be there. That's not what we're here to talk about today and make a decision on that. The bottom line that we wish to underscore is that the debate is still ongoing, right? How do we remember the past and what parts of the past to tell are still up for debate, right? In 2023. Now, should they be up for debate? I'm not sure, right? I mean, that's what we need to figure out. I mean, I don't know how much we debate about when the Constitution was written, right? But in terms of what parts of this story to talk about in terms of Black history, that apparently is still being debated, right? And there's still disagreement as to what part of the story to tell, when to start telling that story. And so in terms of proper context, when we talk about free from what, it's not a matter of, picking up and saying, let's just move across the country, let's just start fresh. No, I mean, you're talking about a system, um, not a group of hillbillies drinking moonshine on a porch saying that we want to be mean, but you're talking about an orchestrated system by law, by moral, by norm, by custom. You're talking about a very entrenched system that was very difficult for African Americans to navigate within, right? When we talk about this era of enslavement, the era of enslavement lasted for a significant period of time. I mean, think about how African Americans, when they first stepped foot in the New World, all right, and if we were to believe Hannah Nicole Smith in her 1619 project, then the date of 1619 is the working starting point. Jamestown, Virginia is when the first recorded ship came with roughly 20 Black people who were sold into enslavement. And while this is not a bash on America session, we're just want to be factual in stating that America did not invent enslavement, so America should not be shamed for that. However, the Americans did, shall we say, put their fingerprint on the enterprise with a racialized form of enslavement. So dating back to Grecian Roman times, enslavement was a common practice for nation states to be able to grow and expand. But typically there were mechanisms by which individuals could be incorporated into society over time, right? Whether through birth or manumission. I mean, there were a number of different aspects. But here in America, one thing that was quite distinct was the racialized aspect. So if you were Black, even if you were not enslaved with the Fugitive Slave Act, there was still a very high chance of you being brought back into enslavement, right? I mean, for those of us who saw the movie 12 Years a Slave, that's what that movie was about. A free Black male who, just on the word of two white males, was brought back into enslavement, right? And not to mention just this overarching and overriding slave culture that really did not recognize the humanity of African Americans, right? And so when you look at the beginning of the Civil War in 1861, Alex Stevens, is credited, if you would, with the birth of white supremacy. He gave this famous cornerstone speech that essentially laid the foundation for America's modern policing system, right? And so, as you can see in his words, he's saying that the cornerstone rests on the great truth, right? Again, truth being potentially a subjective term, but at this point in time, he's positing that his truth is that the Negro is not equal to the white man, right? This is not that far-fetched because let's recall 1857, there was a Supreme Court case entitled Dred Scott, where the Supreme Court said, and I quote, "The Negro has no rights that the white male is bound to respect," right? So this is the larger overarching environment by which African American movement was restricted. It was against the law for African Americans to learn how to read and write, key ingredients to what they tell us is civilized society. Unable to hold property, unable to vote, unable to marry. So when we just say, "Oh, Harriet Tubman just freed a couple of people," I mean, it's a lot more than that in terms of what she had to risk and what others had to risk and what they were fighting against. We're talking about not just escaping one plantation where one owner was just rogue and being mean to people. No, we're talking about escaping an entire system and way of being that fails to recognize at every level one's humanity. I mean, what do you do when the Supreme Court of the land says that you have no rights that anyone is bound to respect? I mean, where else do you go if your Supreme Court says this, right? So while we can point the finger, sure, at Alex Stevens and Confederate states that seceded, I mean, let's not overlook this idea that overall in the entire United States of America, that there was this wrestling or grappling, right? Many of our founding fathers, quote unquote, owned other people while they were serving as president, of this free democratic republic, right? Thomas Jefferson being one of them. He ended up owning over 600 people in his lifetime. And so we have to reconcile with, someone who's able to produce such powerful prose regarding freedom and its ideas, while at the same time practicing the very opposite, right? And there's at least 3 clauses in the Constitution that recognize and speak to the institution of enslavement, right? So again, I mean, this is not just a rogue group of individuals. I'm really trying to underscore this point. I mean, and you have to forgive me, because if our audience feels as if we're spending a little bit too much time on this, only in the sense that I, being a college professor, am dealing with our 19 and 20-year-olders, right? Here on the ground. And I'm telling you that they're coming in fresh out of high school. Mind you, I go to a well-off school. The student body base is typically affluent, right? Where I go, tuition is in the 70s in terms of 70,000 a year. So test scores are not the problem. I mean, we're talking about where I teach in honors college, average SAT score is roughly 1450. ACT score north of 31, right? So high achieving, high flying students. So the capacity is not the issue. The issue is the content. When many of them reach me at the collegiate level, many of them are bereft of basic facts and ideas. Many don't know how many US presidents owned enslaved individuals. Many were not aware. Many simply did not know that the enslavement was mentioned in the Constitution. So these are the pieces that we're missing to contextualize this idea that it wasn't just one woman, Harriet Tubman, who had a bright idea to be a rebel, but really contextualizing the larger overarching system that essentially denied Harriet Tubman's existence. And so I think what that helps is really put in perspective the type of fortitude that she had. I mean, while we, excuse me, realize what she did was difficult, I think what more contextualization will do is really help us appreciate her for who she was and what she did, because it truly is hard to fathom, right? And when we talk about this idea of civil war, many states were very, 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 very serious about this idea. So much so, as you all know, not only did they secede, but they had their own capital. They had their own president, Jefferson Davis, and they had their own currency system, right? That's how serious people were about maintaining the freedom, if you would, to enslave others. So where does that leave us, right? Now, today, Harriet Tubman is the renowned badass that we all agree with, but I'm not sure whether many of us are apprised as to the nuance and detail as to why, right, and what makes her so very significant. So we talk about, her being placed on the $20 bill. There still has been a lot of negotiation about this. It hasn't happened yet. And we do see her, shall we say, glamorized in a movie, that was actually Oscar nominated recently, right? But if there is a caveat, I think that one thing to point out about the Harriet movie is what's interesting is it fits this larger pattern of anytime that you have a African American nominated in a movie for Academy Award, roughly 80% of all movies featuring a Black Academy Award nominee are for movies in which they're in a role dealing with poverty or racism, or they might be in a role dealing with racism and poverty, or they might be in a role dealing with poverty and racism, right? And Harriet would fulfill that pattern. Also, what's interesting about Harriet is that even though it features an American heroine, right? I mean, Harriet Tubman was born in America, and her positionality was, I'm leaving America to Canada for freedom. Like, so there's this idea of locality. For whatever reason, they decided to cast a British individual to play the lead role, Cynthia Erivo, right? So that has been the subject of some side debate as to what does that mean about American heroes having Americans in those roles. And, again, it's one of those debates that I guess we can have, given the fact that they've made several movies about Winston Churchill, and just about every time they've had a British male to play that role. So again, when we talk about Harriet Tubman today, the question is, to what degree do we contextualize her need for heroism and what the level of her heroism meant, right? And so this is a different depiction that I wanted to just share with you all by Comey Olaf. And you see the difference as opposed to the open hand and come with me, and this is great. We're going to go on a field trip and find some freedom. This idea of with armament in hand pointed at the viewer, this reminding us of the militancy required by Harriet Tubman. That's the point, y'all. A certain level of militancy was required. And see, and remember where I started off earlier in the whole conversation. We're having debates right now about critical race theory. We're having debates about advanced placement African-American history. And for some of us, we're going too far. This is too much. But the question is, that's what we're saying right now. But what will they say about us 40 years from now? So in retrospect, in the year 2023, Harriet's is badass and we love her. But during the time in which she was alive, she was viewed as a militant rabble rouser who was disruptive of society. That's the key ingredient we can't forget. She wasn't renowned during her time period. She was causing trouble. She was causing trouble, right? And so during that time period, we have a Mr. Frederick Douglass, right, who was also pretty strident and blunt about his critique of the 4th of July. I don't know if you all had heard this speech. Again, this is another reason to go back and demand the refund from high school. But it's free for you to look up. It's quite lengthy. Be prepared. That's one of the ways in which people had entertainment back in the day, was by watching other people speak for a long period of time, kind of like what we're doing right now, I guess. And so it's a very long speech, but at the same time, it's pretty pointed. I mean, here he was born into slavery. He was born in chains. He escaped, and he leveraged his freedom to advocate for abolitionism, as we all know, and became a powerful statesman and orator. But on the actual 4th of July in 1852, he just said, actually, but what's this about? Why are you asking me to do this? Are you essentially making a hypocrisy of this whole enterprise? What freedom are we talking about, right? You may rejoice, I must mourn, right? This is an inhuman mockery. It's sacrilegious. And so this is the type of rhetoric that was being shared, by strident activists during that time. And so I just want us to remember that when we might look or furrow our eyebrows about people who appear to be caustic to us now, or appear to be too militant in terms of what they're advocating for, when in actuality, many decades, after the fact, we might end up having a different perspective, right? Memory versus history. Speaking of which, I'd like to move on to Rosa Parks before we conclude with Dr. Martin Luther King. So before I get up to Rosa Parks, I just want to do a couple more historical details, right? So you have enslavement, you have the Civil War, which helps lead towards the abolition of enslavement. And how or why did enslavement end? Does anybody know? How or why did enslavement end? Well, obviously we're looking at Lincoln on the screen, and so one of the pieces that comes to mind immediately is the Emancipation Proclamation. And ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately, nothing could be further from the truth. The Emancipation Proclamation was a field military order, and it essentially had the legal heft of the country of Vietnam legislating that everyone who's a member of the Schomburg Library gets a free Tesla, right? I mean, it sounds like a great sounds like a great policy, but I don't know if it's going to happen, right? In terms of another country having any type of sovereignty over us. And so because the South has seceded, the field order that Lincoln issued had no legal bearing, right? Now it was influential, but technically had no legal bearing. And at the time that Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, enslavement was still legal in northern states such as Delaware and Maryland. So in other words, contrary to popular belief, Lincoln didn't free a single soul. And in terms of how enslavement actually ended, it was, as you can see on your screen here, with the passage of the 13th Amendment. And it wasn't until December of 1865, when it was ratified, where enslavement was deemed illegal in the United States of America. Okay, December 1865. But what's so very interesting is there's a loophole. If you look it up, I know it's in cursive right now, it says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime where the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States of America, right? So this loophole is, shall we say, given treatment with this documentary by Ava DuVernay called 13th. It's on Netflix. I recommend you check it out. And this loophole gives rise to the convict lease system. Why is this important? Well, I'm so glad you asked. I'll tell you. The convict lease system is so very important because when we talk about enslavement ending, oftentimes it's quite a superficial explanation and it's quite simplistic. So because the institution of enslavement ended, that didn't mean that we just flipped a light switch and entered this new era of freedom, justice, and pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness, right? That didn't happen instantly. And in fact, the same system continued, but just by a different name. So if you notice, it just so happens that all the people on your screen are African-American male, convict lease system. Well, the reason why that is because the minute that everyone was deemed free, there was a new labor problem at hand. Many of the plantations still needed labor to become productive. And so immediately after everyone was deemed free, you have Southern states that created what we call the Black Codes, where they essentially criminalized Black behavior. So if you did not have a job, you're considered a vagrant. You could be carted off to jail to work off your debt to society. Lo and behold, working off your debt included going back to some of these very same plantations that people were working on when under the enslavement era. So this is the environment that we're entering, right, after enslavement. So there's not this utopia that opens up immediately, right? So remember, after enslavement ends, you have staunch opposition to property redistribution. You already have difficult economic times, which make matters more difficult anyway. But the KKK is founded after enslavement ends. The convict lease system and the Black Codes I just mentioned, not to mention many African Americans being exploited due to sharecropping, just deep and pervasive racism, right? Deep and pervasive. And the only reason why I'm showing this to you is not to be sensational, but to show you. But this was a postcard issued through our United States Postal Service, right? So it's a postcard, right, around the turn of the century, 1900. And so think about how today we have debates over whether Nicki Minaj can, put out a magazine that's too pornographic, but yet this was deemed apparently okay to send out through U.S. Postal Service channels, right? The killing of another individual without any rule of law. I mean, that's what it comes down to. We're all afforded and accorded rule of law, right? So this is the environment around the 1900s. And so I say all that to say that when you fast forward up to the 1950s, we are still in a Jim Crow segregated society. And it's very well practiced. I mean, so if what I showed you was happening around 1900, I mean, around 1950, we're good half century into this. And in many ways, the Jim Crow era was cemented with the 1896 Supreme Court decision, Plessy versus Ferguson, that stated separate but equal, right? Okay, so I just wanted to provide that contextualization for Rosa Parks. So we all know who this is, right? Rosa Parks. This is great. But there's somebody else before Rosa Parks. Does anybody know who this is? Her name is Claudette Colvin. And what's fascinating is earlier that year, because Rosa Parks was arrested in December of 1955, but earlier that year in March, Claudette Colvin was arrested. But the issue was she was considered, it's hard to tell from the picture, but she was considered more dark-skinned, right, in her complexion. And she was a teenager who was pregnant. So the concern was that if the white press got a hold of this information, they would have a field day, and it would distract away from the central cause of unfair treatment on the bus, as opposed to her being a target and being shamed for her lifestyle, right? So this is what Rosa Parks said about Claudette Colvin, right? And so what's fascinating is, Rosa Parks has this reputation for being this taciturn, demure, bespectacled lady who just sat in the bus and just one day was too tired. But in actuality, it was a lot more orchestrated than what it appears. She was very much involved in the Black freedom movement that eventually blossomed to the civil rights movement, and based upon Rosa Parks acknowledging this larger strategy that putting Claudette Colvin wouldn't work. I mean, it was part of talks and negotiations in terms of how do we create the best quote unquote test case whereby we'll make it virtually dummy proof for anyone, where we make it very difficult for anyone to oppose and not get behind. I mean, after all, an elderly bespectacled lady with glasses, I mean, like, how can you not support her? What can you say against her? But again, the point though is that she did not unilaterally and randomly do it, but it was part of a larger concerted strategy that we should give these planners a bit more credit for. And finally, with Dr. Martin Luther King, many of us know him for his very famous oratory in 1963 in Washington, D.C., the I Have a Dream speech, right? And I think what's fascinating is virtually everybody uses this idea of I have a dream, from liberals to conservatives. They use this idea of people not being judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character, right? But what's truly fascinating is to see sometime after his speech what has changed, right? And so he gave the speech in 1963, and at that time that he gave the speech in 1960, as you can see, the rates of incarceration for African Americans compared to whites was still disproportionate. But look at what has happened over 50 years. If anything, you can say these numbers have worsened or improved. I mean, I guess based upon your perspective. So I say that to say that Dr. Martin Luther King also, during the time that he lived, was considered to be a rabble rouser and a problem. One of his more famous letters, a letter from Birmingham jail, was written in jail. He was subject to numerous bomb threats. He was arrested several times. And so what's fascinating is today, the way we remember Martin Luther King, you would think he was this teddy bear who comes down from the Tennessee Lookout Mountain every January, and gives out goodies and treats to all the young people who believe in diversity, right? Everyone marched with Martin Luther King, apparently. You talk to anybody like, I marched with King, and my dad, he was with dark. So the question I have is, well, who was against Dr. Martin Luther King? I mean, everyone you talk to nowadays was with Dr. Martin Luther King. Everybody agreed with him. Well, and in fact, we love him so much, we have sales in his honor, right? Make sure next January you all take advantage, right? That you all take advantage. And we have sales in his honor, right? But at that time, it was a hard sell for him to buy into this idea that Black people were worthy of dignity and respect and should be treated equally. Remember that bus boycott that he ended up leading with Rosa Parks, while it may sound like a slam dunk now, it was over a year. I mean, can you imagine this? For over a year, not a week, retweeting something and hashtagging something. No, we're talking about over a year. Over a year. That's a significant period of time. For over a year. That's how massive the resistance was, right? Where the city was just going to ride around empty buses out of spite rather than allow for people to sit anywhere they want on the bus, right? And again, don't forget to get your promo code, okay? So again, when we talk about this idea of memory versus history, I think it's an excellent question for us to continue to wrestle with. How do we want to remember our future, right? Because when I look at Lincoln and the narratives around, and I'd be curious to hear from you all whether you all knew that the Emancipation Proclamation did not, and how did you find that out? Like, was it something that was taught to you in school or not? Because again, the students I'm receiving still, this is the narrative. Emancipation Proclamation was this magic wand that changed everything. Isn't he a great guy? Lincoln's a great guy. And I'm not saying Lincoln's not a great guy, but when I look at the statute right here, right, this is called the Freedom Statute or Emancipation Statute. There were two of them created by artist Thomas Ball. One was located in Boston, the other Washington, D.C., about a mile east of the Capitol building, right? So after George Floyd, I don't know if you all recall George Floyd, but 2 years ago, May 25th, 2020, we all saw his life being oozed out of his body because of an officer who would not remove a knee from his neck. And so in aftermath of that, many people decided to take stock about what they're doing when it comes to race relations. And the city of Boston decided to take down the statute. This one is still standing in DC. And so when I look at it, these four words just come to mind. I mean, the black male, as you see, is free, but clearly not equal, right? One individual is dressed, the other is not. One individual is kneeling, the other is not. Standing foot. I mean, one individual has chains around their wrist, the other does not. So this idea of free but not equal is what jumps out to me. I'd be curious what your interpretation is. But one thing I do know is that this used to be a statute. And I don't know if any Penn State fans are in the audience there. I mean, you all are part of the Big Ten, but in Illinois, right? But this would be the former site of the statute of Joe Paterno. Yes, Joe Pa, 704 collegiate football victories. And the date, July 22nd, 2012, was the date that they took down the statute, which was less than 30 days after one of his assistant coaches, Jerry Sandusky, was convicted of child molestation. So what's the point? The point is that despite the fact that Joe Paterno has raised, dare I say, billions of dollars for Penn State University, many of us may not even know about Happy Valley, were it not for Penn State football in its ginormous stadium that can fit close to 100,000 individuals, right? And when you think about all the television deals, the paraphernalia that was sold, I mean, just even concessions and parking, and not to mention increase in applications, tuition over the years, all that he represents, they took down his statute because it no longer aligns with their views. And this is what I was saying earlier, y'all, about history is never static, or is it, right? So the question we have to ask ourselves is, when we look at a statute like this, that's still standing, right? And we look at a statute of Joe Paterno that was taken down immediately, despite all of what he means for the Penn State community. I think we have to ask ourselves, does a statute like this exist because the narrative it symbolizes still exists as well? Because in conclusion, when we look at the statutes that we do have in terms of Martin Luther King today, if you haven't been in Washington, D.C., there's a 30-foot memorial in his honor that is quite spectacular. And it's the first monument on the National Mall of a non-white individual. And it's, absolutely a step in the right direction. That being said, the caveat is, even with this statute, there's room for negotiation on how we might be able to do better. The statute, this memorial, if you would, was marred. Technically, it's not a statute, technically. And you all in the library can find a book and back me up on this. But as you're looking at the screen right now, This is what we call high bas relief. It's not a statue in the pure sense, because the body of the subject is not 360 degrees in the round, as we say. So just like if you go to the Jefferson Memorial, in Washington, D.C., off the basin, you can walk around his lifelike body. Here, we can't walk around his body. I mean, he's still being carved out of the stone, as we see. So technically, it's not a statue. That's A. B is this quote here on the side was truncated and was a source of controversy, and they had to redo it. Also, there was controversy regarding the expression on his face. They felt that it looked too militant when it came out. His eyebrows were too furrowed, they said, right? And not to mention that, going back to Cynthia Irvio and Harriet, a sculptor from the country of China was found to complete this. Free country, yes, but there were many within the African-American community who had questions as to why it was difficult, if not impossible, to find an African-American artist to give honor and praise to an African-American citizen being honored on the National Mall, right? And so, again, the idea is that even though we think very lovingly about Dr. King, we often omit and overlook the tensions and the resistance he received while he was alive. And then even now, when we attempt to remember him, there's still debates and ongoing tensions over whether we're doing it the right way, quote unquote. Right? So, closing thoughts. I think the ball is still in our court as to what we want to do moving forward, how much of the history we want to talk about and what to incorporate. When a Walmart comes up with Juneteenth ice cream, is it because they're celebrating the moment? Are they commemorating the moment? Or are they merely capitalizing off the moment, right? When you look at the Ben & Jerry's coming up with all these different flavors, oftentimes they'll claim that a portion is going towards whatever fund. That's great. But as we know, sometimes when you donate to various nonprofits, not 100% of your dollar is going towards the actual target that you had thought. Oftentimes administrative fees get in the way and things of this nature. So, I mean, it's still a fair question as to how do we go about recognizing in the present time our history, right? What's the best way to go about commemorating that? Because in closing, I think what I don't want to be lost in all of this is that when we do take time out of February or any day of the month or year to reflect on those before us who have sacrificed so much for us to have a better America, we want to give them full honor by telling the full story about what they struggled against, right? And for African Americans to have so much against them, right? And again, I'm not here to debate, that your grandmother, grandfather didn't have a hard time, coming over through Ellis Island. It's not to debate that, but what is not up for debate is the fact that when your grandfather was coming over in Ellis Island with 15 cents in their pocket, it was illegal for maybe my great grandfather to even compete against your grandfather, right? It was illegal. Like, there was no way. And so the fact that I'm still here, in this space with you all, says a lot about the people before me, right? It says a lot. And so I think this capacity to still wake up with joy in the morning and to still think about that which is best in America and to think about how to go about achieving that which is best in America and do it the right way instead of January 6th, right? That may perhaps be an inappropriate way to express discontent. And the fact that so many African Americans, like whether it be Rosa Parks, Harriet Tubman, or Dr. Martin Luther King, the fact that they leveraged their voices for others, despite the fact that there was considerable resistance at that time. We admire them for it now. And we give praise to them now. But again, it's a two-part equation for me. I think by giving full voice to everything they struggled against, we are better able to appreciate their strength, and also it puts into perspective to what degree that we should be perhaps raising up our voices in the current day and age. It takes a lot of strength to swim against the grain, right? And that's what these people did. So be sure to get your coupon codes and be sure to keep African American history near and dear to your heart, because honestly, I find it very difficult to tell the story of American history without invoking African American history as well. Thank you.
All right. And thank you, Dr. Gooding. If you have questions for him, please put them in either the chat box or the Q&A box, and we will get to those when we can. Something that you touched on, I think, with each of the figures you talked about is that there is a sense that what does the population at large, how do they relate to these figures when their cultural history, their ethnic history, maybe their racial makeup history is with those that own slaves? How do they wrestle with that? And you cannot but feel that the rewriting of these historical figures, the leaving out of these details, is for those people to be easier accepted by the majority that they were fighting against when they were alive.
I really appreciate that question, Matthew, because my position is that by acknowledging the whole truth, right? The idea that great ideas, but as with most human beings, flawed, right? Just like, we have parents, and as we get older, we realize that, well, a couple of things happen. I mean, when we hit that teenage stage, we realize, oh, these people are flawed. How come they're telling me what to do? But then when we all of a sudden magically get married and have kids ourselves, we're like, well, actually, maybe mom wasn't that far off, like actually dad made it look easy, right? So there's this cycle that we go through in terms of appreciation, right? And I think when we talk about history, very something similar can happen, whereby by telling the full story and seeing how these people had great ideas but were flawed, that helps us appreciate the great American experiment that we have and what we need to do to still think critically about, well, it's not a perfect work, but a work in progress. Because I think when we set it up and the expectation is so high that these people came down from Mount Sinai, they had the tablets, like God spake into their ears and gave them the Constitution, then that kind of puts us in this position of we're reticent to critique it and to tweak it. Now all of a sudden it's like, well, it's blasphemy for us to now criticize Thomas Jefferson. Now we're painting ourselves into these corners and indefensible positions. I can't defend the fact that Thomas Jefferson potentially raped Sally Hemings. I mean, we're talking about he fathered 6 children with Sally Hemings. And according to the math, and again, you can go on the Monticello website, they will tell you that she may have had her first kid when she was like 14 years old. So us understanding this is embarrassing. It is absolutely dark. But the question is, does it take away from his writings? I don't know. I don't think it has to. I mean, I think 2 things can be true. I think he could have had these profound thoughts, but it could have been, as they say, conflicted or complex. And so what that does then for me is it doesn't completely nullify the beautiful prose, but it does help contextualize how much weight I should put on it. Because to the extent that, Matt, here we are in 2023, and we're still talking about rights, equality, dignity, the fact that we're still talking about it, well, that makes sense to me, because the model that was set in motion from the very beginning, it wasn't perfect. I mean, it was flawed. It did not account for the pieces that we're talking about right now, which is the reason why we're still talking about them. Otherwise, if the problem was solved, maybe we'd be talking about something else right now.
And I think something that you just brought up that I think is really interesting, because I know we didn't talk about some of the other figures of the civil rights era around Martin Luther King, some of the other personalities, some of the other trailblazers. And I do feel, and you're going to know this better than I will, but in our historical context, the very simple narrative that we give is that you have Malcolm X on one side, you have Martin Luther King on the other. Martin Luther King only believed in peace and love and justice, and Malcolm X was, seen as someone who advocated for violence, even though by the end of their lives,
Yeah,
they had
and I'm
switched
so very glad you,
positions.
and I'm so very glad you mentioned that, because it is true that when you look at Dr. Martin Luther King's trajectory, remember, what is he famous for? The I Have a Dream speech, 1963. The question is, how many of his speeches after that are as famous? And so towards the end, he was leaning towards what we might call more socialist agenda, right? Where he was literally sleeping on the floor of 10-minute apartment buildings in Chicago. His whole idea was poverty is the ill, capitalism is the ill. I'm against the war and what this means in terms of capitalism. And that was a message that was very unpopular, right? You have this Nobel Peace Prize winner who has a potential platform, people listening to him. And so what's fascinating is how he was not as highly regarded in the public eye towards the end of his career, where on the flip side, Malcolm X, very strident and very caustic in his critiques, many of them logical, but very caustic and very blunt. And a lot of people didn't like that early on. He also had some other ideas, that were problematic in terms of, Yakub. I mean, how do you, all white men are devils, and okay, really, how do you justify that? Where does that come from? But in terms of his critiques of America, he was a pretty formidable foe on television, right? In terms of people debating with him. That being said, after he went to Mecca and took his pilgrimage or Hajj, right, within the Muslim faith, you're supposed to go and pay homage and go east to Mecca to pay homage. So once he did that, he adopted what we call a more ecumenical stance, where he wasn't quite so strident in all things Muslim are excellent, where he was a little bit more open to this idea of, all faiths have, different strengths. I'm trying to learn more from my brothers and sisters, and so the idea is that Malcolm X was moving more towards this, how can we get along to partner of expression, right? How do we, formulate, larger partnerships and coalitions, whereas King was moving in a different direction. And so the idea is that, going back to where we started earlier, memory versus history, at what point did we start the story? At what point did we end the story? And so for many of us, we start and stop that story with King with, he came out of nowhere to help out with this bus boycott, led all these marches, and man, he had this beautiful dream. Isn't that beautiful? And there's more to that story.
For sure. And I think the point you made about we only benefit from learning the truth about the different figures in our history. Again, seeing the full picture of someone like Rosa Parks, who did a lot of great work and was recognized for a lot of great work in her lifetime. It is good to know where Rosa Parks and why Rosa Parks was put forward.
And the thing is, when it comes to history, that's where oftentimes our logic escapes us, right? I mean, because we see this so many times, like say, for example, with sports stars or music stars. We understand that there's this flow over time and often change over time, right? How many times, right, ladies, for anyone who's listening, have you gone to a concert to see, this one person you've been following for a long time? You show up to the concert, you paid this money, and they're not singing the songs that you showed up for. They're singing all this new with you. I don't want to see this new. I want to hear the stuff I came to see you for, right? The old stuff, right? I literally was just complaining about Dr. Cornel West came, and I was like, man, I want to hear the Cornel West that I knew. He's talking about something else right now, right? So in other words, when it comes to history, we're a bit more protective as far as, no, I'm always going to remember George Washington the way I remember George Washington. So, but this idea that we know that artists change over time, and and so you understand there's a certain era that you might like, or the first couple albums that were never going through that phase. With history, for some reason, we're a bit more stringent, and we say, no, that one positive impression, they must always stay that way. And we literally erect these statutes to encapsulate a moment frozen in time, right? Now think about the Iwo Jima Memorial. It's literally just a moment in time, right? But that's how we always want to remember And who doesn't want to be remembered in their best light? Think about how most people on social media right now are posting their best, right? Putting the best foot forward. And there's a lot of debate over, to what degree, people are getting confused over what's real versus, do you put something that's depressing out there versus, do you want people to see your best foot forward? But when it comes to history, though, I think we have a different set of protocols because history is something that we all share, right? But we all don't necessarily have a say in what we're supposed to share. That's the tricky part, right? So when we get down to the finer details about what part of the story remember, what part, at what point do we start telling the story, which details are important to include or emphasize, that's where we have the inconsistencies. And so my perspective is that if you tell the truth and it is verifiable, if it is true, right? Because remember, it'd be one thing if I'm just making salacious claims about Thomas Jefferson, but it's another thing if what I told you is true. And again, what I said about him fathering at least 6 is true. And so that adds to the story. It adds to the story. It makes it more complex. It makes it more nuanced. And what it does is, and maybe this is the reason why, Matt, that many of us are not interested in being challenged, because it puts more work on us, I think. The onus is more on us because now I have to do some serious wrestling. Like, how do I reconcile this in my head? This idea that he wrote some of the most beautiful prose. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Oh my Lord, this is poetic. It is powerful. But yet at the same time, how do you go to bed at night knowing that like somebody, is literally like chained, like in your yard? Like how does that, well, I mean, just like we're fascinated about, we're watching like, these documentaries about, how does someone become, I mean, I think, again, full contextualization doesn't hurt us, especially when we see, okay, well, if that was then, guess what? I have the capacity and power in this present moment to maybe challenge myself, ask myself the tough questions, and actually, I have an opportunity to influence the future. I think that's what's exciting about it, Matthew. It's not a matter of, oh, that sucks. Now I had this great impression about Thomas Jefferson, and now that's shattered. No, if anything, understanding Thomas Jefferson fully helps you understand your moment in time.
I think that's an excellent place to end it because that is absolutely true. Dr. Frederick Gooding, thank you so much for sharing with us once again. We always love having you. And do you have anything else you want to say before we go for the night?
For anyone who doesn't agree, that is perfectly fine. The fact that we are engaged in conversation is what's most important. I hope that you continue to talk about this with coffee with your friend, at dinner table with the family. It's not a matter about agreeing, it's a matter of engaging. And may we continue to engage and wrestle with that we feel is important.
You should really get that put on like a wood thing, hang it up in someone's house. I think that sounds great. What a wonderful ethos for lifelong education. I think that's wonderful. Dr. Gooding, thank you once again. And thank you to you at home for joining us. Again, there will be a recording of this on our Schaumburg Library YouTube page. I will send out the link when it is ready. All right, everybody. Thank you so much and have a great night. We'll see you at the next one.